Well, good afternoon and a warm welcome to the Hunter Halls here at the University of Glasgow. I'm Graham Roy and I'm a Professor of Economics at the University of Glasgow and also Dean of External Engagement in the College of Social Sciences, and it's my pleasure to be your host for today. Before we get into the detail of today's event, some quick housekeeping. There are no planned emergency drills, so if the alarm goes off, please do leave through the exits at the back and follow the instructions of university staff. Yesterday was our 573rd birthday here at the university, and at Glasgow we pride ourselves on the impact that our research has in the real world, and also as a place that helps facilitate debate on the grand challenges facing society. And many of you will know that just last year we launched our new Centre for Public Policy here at the university, which is growing our research potential in policy making both here in Scotland but also with our partners around the world. And it's also developing innovative learning programmes for the current and next generation of policymakers. In that context, we're pleased, therefore, to be hosting today's talk, An Industrial Strategy in an Independent Scotland, for the Scottish Government as part of their Building a New Scotland series. After a slow recovery from the pandemic, a cost of living crisis, and an uncertain outlook for inflation and interest rates, the economy is once again at the top of political debate. It will no doubt dominate the upcoming UK general election, and it continues to shape the constitutional debate here in Scotland. And today is therefore an important opportunity for those of us with an interest in understanding the latest thinking of all our policymakers to hear about the Scottish Government's view of the current environment and where they see the future economic direction of the country as being best served. I'm delighted that to deliver this speech today we welcome to Glasgow, Scotland's First Minister, Humza Yousaf. The First Minister is the MSP for Glasgow Pollock, having been first elected to the Scottish Parliament in 2011, and has held various cabinet and ministerial posts, including in justice and health. And most importantly, and it would be, of course, remiss of me not to mention this, the First Minister is the latest of a line of Glasgow graduates who have gone on to distinguished public service, from his predecessors, Nicola Sturgeon and Donald Dewar, through to Charles Kennedy and John Smith. The First Minister will speak for around about 40 minutes and then we'll have time for some Q&A. We do have quite a hard stop today, so apologies in advance if I can't get around to everybody in the Q&A. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming Scotland's First Minister, Humza Yousaf. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham, for that introduction. You're right, I'm an alumni of this world-class university. The last time I was in this hall, I was sitting an exam, so I'm sure I'll be well used to the interrogation that comes thereafter. You mentioned, of course, I should say happy birthday for your 573rd birthday. The university doesn't look a day older than 572. So, look, you are most welcome here. Happy New Year, of course, to all of you. I want to thank Graham. I want to thank the University of Glasgow for hosting me today. I do hope that all of you have managed an enjoyable and a restful festive break. If we can say one thing about 2024 is that it won't be uneventful. So I hope you have managed some element of a break. When it comes to the UK economy, however, I would say that it is not a time for optimism or hope. Optimism and hope, of course, is what characterises any new year. But that sense of hope, that sense of possibility, has been lacking for far too many people for far too long. And when it comes to UK politics, there is perhaps even less reason for optimism. The phrase working assumption has been doing the media rounds over the last week. Well, I have a working assumption for you. The working assumption is that there will be an absence of a substantial policy debate at Westminster. And that may be a reason why the rhetoric in this election year is likely to be particularly fierce as Labour and the Tories throw ever more ugly insults at each other. I think it's fair to say that what is best for Scotland is likely to be a distant afterthought as battle rages over slogans such as "Stop the Boats." That means for Scotland, and indeed the whole of the UK, there is a gap. Firstly, for a party that, amidst that ugly, insular Westminster contest, a gap for a party that will stand up for Scotland's interests in all constitutional circumstances. And secondly, for a plan to build a stronger and fairer economy, and with that, a better country. One that offers a more hopeful, a more optimistic future, and one that is very much rooted in evidence. So today I want to focus on what that evidence is telling us about the UK and the damage that decades of failed Westminster economic policy has caused here in Scotland, and indeed right across the entirety of the UK. But perhaps before doing that, I can make a broader political point. The way I like to do my politics, it's always been my preference, wherever possible, is to try to bring people together. That means I'll always try to put myself in other people's shoes, see things from their point of view where I can. It's not just the right thing to do, it's not just a civil thing to do, that of course it is, but it's also about raw politics, because from a very selfish political perspective, I've never thought the I'm right, you're wrong, you must vote for me approach is the most persuasive way of winning people over to your point of view. So by properly listening to opposing points of view, sometimes even on apparently contentious subjects, as contentious as independence, there will be a realisation that actually our ambitions perhaps are not so different. So clearly the most important concern that people have right now is the cost of living. But we all want the same things in life. Our ambition is for our families to be able to get on in life, to have good, fulfilling, well-paid jobs that we know will last. Because with that comes a whole sense of security, a sense of opportunity, a whole world of opportunity, of good health and happiness that opens up. That's something I think all of us can and will agree on. But there are two other relevant considerations that I would argue there is broad consensus on here in Scotland. Firstly, the way Westminster runs the economy isn't working for Scotland. And secondly, Brexit has damaged and will continue to damage the economy. And therefore, those aspirations for better living standards and greater security will also be damaged. So turning now to that point I was making a moment ago about the importance of seeing things from other people's point of view. There will be those who will never support independence, no matter what I or indeed others say. That doesn't mean that those people should be dismissed, far from it. There is much to learn from an opposing perspective. And we can all still engage, even if we do disagree, respectfully. There will be others who are sympathetic to independence, but they're not yet persuaded, or they don't think that now is the right time. Well, it's my argument that independence is urgent, and now is precisely the time. It is urgent because the cost of living is at the very top of people's concerns. Because it is through independence, and in particular the powerful combination of independence and EU membership, that we can raise living standards. That doesn't mean shouting independence even louder. It means engaging in a deliberative process where competing views are considered. Scotland's political and media culture today doesn't always lend itself to that deliberative process, but it is one which I think we should always strive to engage in. As part of presenting that evidence-based economic case for independence, the Scottish Government has already published a number of papers in the Building a New Scotland series. These have covered a multitude of topics, such as the macroeconomic framework for an independent Scotland, currency arrangements, EU membership, and migration. And today I'm delivering the first in a series of speeches to be delivered this year that will expand on the economic case for independence. And because the idea is to promote a deliberative, evidence-based process, these speeches are designed to be read with full referencing as much as they are designed to be delivered. The series is called the Higher Living Standards Series because the aim is this: to show how, with independence, we can build a more productive economy that will generate higher living standards for the people of this country. The topics we will cover during this series, they intend to include building economic consensus to benefit business and indeed wider society. There will be a speech on investment, on workers' rights in the labour market, on ownership and governance, and the focus of today's speech, which I will turn to very shortly, industrial policy in an independent Scotland. But perhaps first, let me address the urgency of the overall case. It is urgent, and indeed it is essential, because I will argue that the low growth, high inequality, Brexit-based UK economy cannot provide long-term economic security or indeed opportunity. And it is urgent because damaging economic trends are becoming hardwired into the UK and Scottish economies, regardless of which party is in charge in Westminster. The longer we continue on that path, the harder it becomes to change course. So the idea of a cost of living crisis in the UK isn't actually entirely accurate. The use of the word crisis implies that it's something that is simply temporary. But for far too many people in the UK, and of course including here in Scotland, low living standards are a permanent feature of their lives. This isn't a matter of simply changing Westminster government. Both Labour and the Conservatives agree that the UK should be out of the European Union, the huge European single market. They also both want to cut vital inward migration. These are just two examples, just two of the examples, which demonstrate that for the two main UK-based parties, Westminster political interest will always override Scottish economic interest. And that's a major problem. Scotland has no macroeconomic powers. We have no control over migration, we have no control over employment policy, competition policy, a host of other economic levers, and we only have very limited borrowing powers for capital investment. But this is much more than simply one or two individual policy levers. This is about being locked into a failed UK economy. And for most people, the UK economy run by Westminster has indeed failed. Analysis published in the Financial Times describes the UK as a poor society with pockets of rich people. Real wages have been stagnant. It's now estimated that wages will not recover to their 2008 level until 2028. Inequality in the UK surged in the 1980s. It's remained high ever since. Indeed, the share of total income going to the top 1% of people under the last Labour government was consistently higher than even under Margaret Thatcher. Productivity growth, the key driver of living standards, has been poor. According to the Resolution Foundation, the UK's productivity gap with France, Germany and the US has doubled since 2008 to 18%. Business investment is worryingly low. Public capital investment has also been both low and volatile. And the UK displays a remarkable level of geographic inequality with a very unhealthy and economically unstable reliance on London. Such is the reliance on London that UK governments, despite bemoaning the problem for years, end up only strengthening its comparative position. Their fear is that if anything happened to the London economy, the whole UK house of cards will collapse. So that leads to yet even more investment in the UK capital and decisions such as scrapping the cap on bankers' bonuses in an attempt to maintain London's competitive position. Just recently, look at the example of the UK government scrapping the Birmingham to Manchester leg of HS2, claiming savings of £36 billion for alternative investment in the north. And last month, of course, they announced £235 million of funding for London using HS2 money. It seems that when the UK government talks of investment in the north, they can't see much past Watford. So it's impossible to see how any Westminster government, particularly with both main parties, both UK-based parties, committed to Brexit and with no real economic alternative being presented from Keir Starmer, how they can change this trend. So continuing to put faith in a failed Westminster economic policy-making model, well, I would argue that's letting the people of Scotland down. Indeed, It has been argued that UK economic performance has been so poor it has decoupled from the economic development path of other comparator wealthy countries. I believe it is therefore our duty as the Scottish Government, dedicated to the interests of the Scottish people, to set out the alternative path, one that leads to a renewed sense of possibility. It should then be for the people of Scotland to decide between these two futures. And this is where the case for optimism that I referred to at the start of my remarks comes from. So that optimism is based on three factors. Firstly, extraordinary resources, such as renewable energy, key economic strength, of course, such as our great universities, of which this is a world-leading example, our long-standing capabilities in renewables, advanced engineering, food and drink, life sciences, creative industries, our finance sector, our business sector are recognised the world over. As well as these traditional strengths, we've got specialisms in industries of the future, digital technology, including artificial intelligence and cybersecurity, building on Edinburgh's international prominence in data and AI, and its aims to be the data capital of Europe. Dundee, of course, has leadership in gaming, again boosted by the higher education sector, and our aerospace and space technology sectors are absolutely thriving. Secondly, our use of, albeit limited, devolved powers, which we're using to help business and boost the economy as best we can. In using those powers, I've recognised the need to improve our relationship with business and the involvement of business in policy making. The Scottish Government has now put in place a framework to make that happen. However, let me recognise, notwithstanding that business reset, that the overall approach pursued by the Scottish Government will not always find universal favour. Our approach is that of a social contract approach, where those on the highest incomes are asked to contribute a little bit more in order to help fund universal benefits that help to build a more cohesive society, while allowing us to also target resources and support for those that need it the most. It's an approach that's typified by the fact that right here in Scotland, people don't pay prescription charges. The university fees have been abolished. This demonstrates the value of taking decisions here in Scotland for Scotland. This has not been achieved at the expense of relative economic performance. Indeed, since 2007, since the SNP took office, GDP per head has grown by 10% in Scotland. That's compared to 6% in the UK. Productivity has grown an annual average rate of 1% a year compared with the UK's 0.5%. But let's not be under any illusions. Independent estimates show that billions of pounds have already been wiped from the UK economy compared to if we had EU membership. And that feeds through into the amount of money that's available, of course, to spend on public services like the NHS. But it doesn't have to be this way. And then that leads me to the third reason that we should have optimism. The real-life shining example for Scotland that we can aspire to. Independent countries that are significantly fairer and wealthier than the UK. Countries like Ireland, like Norway, Denmark, they have both higher productivity but also lower inequality than the UK. In other words, they combine that economic dynamism with social solidarity. So with all of our strength, the key question is this: why not Scotland? In a recent well-publicised report, the Resolution Foundation said that if the United Kingdom had the average income and inequality of similar countries, then the typical household would be £8,300 better off. And if we use that very same analysis for countries that are similar to Scotland, the prize for the typical Scottish household would be even greater. They would be £10,200 better off. That then is the huge prize of independence. Not to match the performance of those independence countries overnight, no one's suggesting that is going to happen, but to start catching up so that Scotland becomes more normal for nations that are like us. So how do we achieve that more normal economic performance? Well, one of the striking things about the national economic debate in the UK is, in some respects, the complete absence of one. The UK-based parties, Labour, the Conservatives, the Liberal Democrats, offer little hope to the people of the UK, let alone here in Scotland. They not only want to continue with an economic model that has had such disastrous consequences for households up and down the country, they all agree that the economic powers I referenced earlier should remain at Westminster. So even within the confines of the current constitutional setup, the UK-based parties have nothing different, nothing new, nothing bold to offer the people of Scotland. They're not interested in what we could do with macroeconomic powers and other economic powers if they were under the control of the Scottish Parliament. I am. Indeed, given the failed UK economy, my overriding ambition is to demonstrate how we can build a new, stronger and more productive Scottish economy with the powers of independence. Because that will mean higher living standards for the people of this country. And that then brings me to the second half of this speech, industrial policy in an independent Scotland, which will be one of the keystones of the new, better economy that I believe is possible. So let me be clear at this point about the general approach. To get the more normal, higher household incomes enjoyed by independent countries like Scotland, the most important action we can take, by far, is to build strong, long-lasting, resilient foundations. There are three foundations for industrial policy in an independent Scotland. Crucially, they all have to work as a package, and individually, they won't have the desired effect without interacting with each other. They're not rabbits out of a hat designed for a day's headlines. Much more importantly, they will drive more effective policy and produce better outcomes. The three foundations for a successful industrial policy for an independent Scotland are as follows. Join the European Union. Establish a dynamic government ministry to drive industrial policy and consensus building right across institutions, but also with external stakeholders. And then crucially and importantly, large-scale public investment in key areas of comparative advantage. I'll return to these measures shortly, but it might be helpful to pause and consider why industrial policy is currently so topical. It was the economist Diane Coyle, she recently joked that like flared trousers, like platform heels, like inflation and other 1970s phenomena, industrial policy is back in fashion. And industrial policy, the idea of direct government intervention to boost specific sectors, is a very fiercely contested area of economics. It's provoked debate since at least 1791, when the first US Treasury Secretary and the son of a Scot, Alexander Hamilton, published his report on the subject of manufactures. And this debate has often been heated and often ideological in its nature. For a prolonged period between the 1970s and the global financial crisis, debate was dominated by industrial policy's opponents, some of whom believed that there was essentially no, or at least very limited, role for government in economic development. And throughout this period, industrial policy was often unfairly caricatured as government's attempts to pick winners. And it is undoubtedly true that there were, of course, failures, but we overlook often the fact that there were significant successes too. These include the pivotal role of state industrial policy in the rapid development of Japan, of Korea, Taiwan, as well as the de facto industrial policies pursued in the United States through the Pentagon and NASA, which contributed so substantially to general technological progress too. And today, there is simply no doubt, right across the globe, explicit industrial policy is back. But we can see that. We can see that when we look right across the world. Let's look at what's happening in the US, in China, in the European Union. In October last year, Brian Deese, the chair of President Biden's National Economic Council, he explained the administration's new approach with great force and great clarity. He explained that a modern American industrial policy identifies areas where relying on private industry on its own will simply not mobilise the investment necessary to achieve our core economic and national security interests. It didn't seek to replace or sideline the private sector, quite the opposite. It used public investment to crowd in more private investment in order to strengthen the national bottom line. This speech and others signal a bold commitment to industrial policy, a concept that was long out of fashion amongst American political and policy elites. This radical departure in the United States economic policy is reflected in recent legislation, whether it's the CHIPS Act introduced in 2022, whether it's the Inflation Reduction Act, of course, which provides $369 billion US dollars of climate-related tax credits, subsidies and loans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also build US technology leadership in a range of green sectors, as well as creating good jobs. The US is explicitly trying to shift the industrial foundations of their country and, somewhat controversially, prioritise domestic production. And the early signs are that the impact on the US economy is positive. US Treasury analysis confirms that real manufacturing and construction spending has doubled since the end of 2021. The increase coincides with the introduction of the Inflation Reduction Act, of the CHIPS Act, and similar trends are not observed in necessarily other advanced economies. Analysis indicates that the longer-term impact is likely to be positive and significant. Let's turn now to China. China's commitment to industrial policy has been strengthened in recent years. Made in China 2025 was launched in 2015. It's the Chinese government's 10-year industrial plan to rotate their manufacturing base away from that low-value, low-wage activities towards higher-tech, high-value, future-facing industries. And of course, chief amongst these are electric vehicles, next-generation information technologies and telecommunications, AI, and advanced robotics. The plan includes the setting of specific targets, extensive direct subsidies, as well as encouraging foreign investment and acquisition. Inevitably, other major economies viewed the 10-year plan as not only a threat to global trade rules, but also a security risk. And it's no secret that China's development helps to explain recent strategy in the US and in the European Union. And given the Scottish Government's aspiration for Scotland to rejoin the European Union as an independent country, it's EU policy that is the most relevant for us. The EU itself, we have seen, has shifted towards pursuing a policy of strategic autonomy while ensuring Europe is globally competitive. This will mean that life will inevitably become colder for non-EU countries seeking to do business with the colossal European single market. The European Union has introduced a series of high-profile measures in response to developments in the United States. So you have the EU CHIPS Act, the Critical Raw Materials Act, and perhaps most crucially for Scotland, the Green Deal Industrial Plan. The Green Deal Industrial Plan, it aims to build industrial capacity in green technologies, thereby accelerating that transition to net zero. The EU Commission has pledged to mobilise at least €1 trillion in sustainable investments over the next decade. Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, argues that we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to show the way with speed, ambition and a sense of purpose to secure the EU's industrial lead in the fast-growing net zero technology sector. So the EU's approach is, in part, aimed at defending businesses and workers from the potential adverse side effects of US and Chinese industrial policy. There is an ongoing debate amongst EU countries about the scale and the nature of that approach, but it's clear that the global financial crisis and the pandemic have upended many of the economic orthodoxies that hitherto influenced policy. So industrial policy is back on the table, and the world's great economic powers are intervening at a rate and a scale not witnessed for decades. So there, in all of this, where does the UK stand? Well, the answer, very simply, is that the UK stands still. Despite its relatively poor economic performance, recent events don't appear to have provoked the UK into any new, let alone radical thinking on industrial policy. So while the US intervenes to stimulate investments in the industries of the future, enhance economic resilience and shape a fairer economy, the EU plans something similar. Ideological antipathy prevents the UK government from taking a similarly creative or proactive approach. Given the scale of Scotland's huge renewable potential and the need for investment so that that potential can actually be realised, this inaction, this inertia from the UK government is, in my view, simply unforgivable. Of course, the UK's track record on industrial policy does invite reflection. While it's possible to trace failures back many decades, the recent record of the Conservative government since 2010 begs particular interrogation. This period has witnessed a rapid turnover in ministers and inability to commit to any specific strategy or to effectively coordinate related streams of activity. There's been similar churn in related institutions which research shows to be crucial and critical to the success of industrial policy. The Industrial Strategy Council was established in 2018, it was abolished in 2021, just as it was beginning to gain its momentum and some status. Diane Coyle summarises the problem. She says that UK industrial policy has been characterised by frequent policy reversals, announcements driven by political cycles, and there's an enduring inability to effectively coordinate the multiple public bodies, departments and levels of government responsible for its delivery. Given the state of current political polls, it does seem likely, of course, that there will be a change of government at Westminster this year. But despite the Labour Party's apparent admiration for the US approach, Keir Starmer seems far more interested, far more concerned about neutralising Conservative attacks than sticking to his principles and commitments. We can see that over the now major question marks over the timing and scale of their green investment plan. In fact, it's been downgraded, I think, from a plan to an ambition. In a speech earlier this year, Jake Sullivan, President Biden's national security advisor, explained that the US will unapologetically pursue our industrial strategy at home while being unambiguously committed to not leaving our friends behind. We want them to join us, he said. We need them to join us. He talked of the need to move beyond traditional trade deals to far more innovative new economic partnerships focused on the core challenges of our time. He spoke of partnerships with Korea, with Japan, with the European Union, with Taiwan, with Canada, with India, Brazil, Indonesia and Angola. He discussed the Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity. He talked about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, talked about the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. One country was conspicuous by its absence from this discussion, the United Kingdom. So if Westminster is failing us, if the current restrictions of devolution are inhibiting us, the question naturally turns to what could we do as an independent nation? And crucially for Scotland, industrial policy can no longer be synonymous just with manufacturing. Any effective industrial policy will have to recognise and seek to expand on Scotland's dynamic, outward-looking and highly productive tradable services. We will focus more on crucial services sector later in the series. It's also important to stress that we're not sitting on our hands waiting for constitutional change to happen. Rather, we're working hard to boost the economy within the tight constraints of the current devolution settlement. That work will strengthen the starting point for effective industrial policy post-independence. So, for instance, we've invested £75 million in the National Manufacturing Institute Scotland, which opened its flagship building in Renfrewshire in June. Our space strategy lays the foundations for capturing a $4 billion share of the global space market. And it's had some early successes, including the decision by US-based Mangata Network to establish a major satellite manufacturing facility in Ayrshire, creating up to 575 high-skilled, high-wage jobs. And most relevantly, in respect to future industrial policy, we're developing our green industrial strategy for Scotland. within the current constitutional setup to target the biggest areas of opportunity as the world moves from a reliance on fossil fuels to renewables and more sustainable jobs. A recent budget provided investment of £66.9 million to kickstart our commitment of up to £500 million to anchor a new offshore wind supply chain here in Scotland. And this in turn will stimulate and support private investment in the infrastructure and manufacturing facilities critical to the growth of the sector. And rapid progress is already very much underway. The total output supported by the renewable energy sector in Scotland nearly doubled to £10.1 billion, and total full-time employment increased from 27,000 to 42,000 over the last year. But as we've seen recently, we're still at the mercy of volatile and unstable UK energy and climate change policy. So let me turn now to independence and the three policies and the key policies that I referenced at the start of this speech, which I think will be most effective. Joining the EU as an independent country, establishing that dynamic government ministry for industrial policy that provides coherence within government, but also crucially with external agencies and businesses, and thirdly, major public investment in key areas of comparative advantage. So firstly, with the European Union, an independent Scotland within the EU would be able to focus and align our policy in order to maximise the economic benefits of our existing strength, as well as support key areas of potential. Crucially, as a member state in its own right, for the first time, Scotland would be fully involved in policy development and decision making. Scotland's voice in European industrial policy would be bolstered by the disproportionate role that we could play in the production of renewable energy, helping to meet climate change targets. The EU's Green Deal industrial plan has the potential to support the rapid development of Scotland's green sectors by providing a predictable and simplified regulatory environment, additional sources of finance, measures to support skills development, and access to EU and indeed other markets too. So let's discuss two specific examples. First, carbon capture and storage, CCS. CCS involves capturing CO2 at source, storing it permanently under the North Sea. It is the only credible route for many of our key strategic industries to decarbonise. The Climate Change Committee describes CCS as a necessity, not as an option. Scotland is one of the best placed nations in Europe to deploy CCS due to our unrivalled access to vast storage potential in the North Sea. So when you take that geological endowment, add it to our existing oil and gas infrastructure, and then align it with our expertise and world-class workforce, you can see how Scotland has absolutely the opportunity to be the centre of the European hub for the importation and storage of CO2 from Europe. Under Westminster policy control, there remains a disappointing lack of detail on timeframes or funding for the Acorn CCS project, and of course the whole range of CO2 capture projects at sites at Peterhead, at Grangemouth, Mossmoran, that compromise the Scottish cluster. The EU's proposed Net Zero Industry Act, however, sets a 50 million tonne per annum target for CO2 storage by 2030. In Scotland, we have much more storage capacity than we need. In fact, by some estimates, we have 18% of Europe's potential storage. It's an incredible strategic asset that we want to share with our partners in Europe as we collectively tackle the climate emergency. To do so, we will require interconnected CO2 transport. We will require storage networks drawing upon Peterhead Port with its proximity to the Acorn project at St Fergus, and this system could foreseeably develop in the North Sea region by the mid-2030s. And the second example is that of hydrogen, another area of significant potential for Scotland. Green hydrogen, made by using renewable electricity, will be needed at scale for Scotland to achieve energy security, but also in order for us to tackle climate change. The production of hydrogen offers a new industrial opportunity for Scotland, one that could provide significant employment a valuable supply chain and major export opportunities. The EU's hydrogen strategy aims to increase hydrogen from its current 2% to 13 to 14% of Europe's energy mix by 2050. And Scotland is well placed to contribute to that target. We have the resources, we have the people, we have the ambition to realise the benefits of becoming a leading hydrogen nation. And as an EU member state, common certification and standards would facilitate the export of hydrogen to other members. And Scotland would also be able to access the various EU funding programmes aimed at boosting hydrogen production. Therefore, as an independent state with greater control over our own energy system and an EU member able to exploit the advantages of the single market, Scotland could supply hydrogen to nations such as Germany, where we know demand will be high and where there's already significant interest in Scotland's hydrogen potential. We could also help Europe meet its CO2 storage targets while building a world-leading CCS industry with significant export potential. In so doing, we can diversify the market for renewable energy in Scotland, while of course strengthening energy security and industrial competitiveness in Europe. An independent Scotland in the EU could be a prime location for sectors that will have to decarbonise. Driven by hydrogen and other renewables, and with the CO2 storage capacity provided by CCS, these industries would be able to access and serve the European single market without the trade or regulatory barriers currently facing Scotland in the UK. So let me turn now to effective government and institution building. In an independent Scotland, we would establish a new Ministry for Industrial Policy to ensure industrial policy has not just appropriate profile and status with and beyond government, but also cohesiveness and a coherence to that policy. This new government department would be ultimately responsible for the design, for the delivery of industrial policy with the new policy levers of independence. A standalone ministry will demonstrate strong long-term commitment to industrial policy. The new ministry will be complemented by an Industrial Policy Council to provide that independent expertise and advice, direction, monitoring and indeed evaluation. It will help to build buy-in and consensus on strategy design and crucially contribute to identifying what is working, but also what is not working. The Council will comprise experts and practitioners from business, from academia, from unions. It will draw on expertise and experience from across Scotland's borders. It will be established on a statutory footing in order to demonstrate that long-term commitment and avoid the constant institutional tinkering that has plagued UK industrial policy, members being appointed for a minimum term. The Council's role and status will reflect the importance placed on industrial policy, and it will engage directly with the First Minister and all of the government, not just its own ministry. It will also have an important role in promoting innovation and maximising new economic opportunities. A key initial task will be to ensure the broader institutional infrastructure, including the enterprise networks, Scottish National Investment Bank, Skills Development Scotland, and relevant industry leadership groups are working effectively in the new context of independence in pursuit of those agreed industrial policy goals. And as part of the inclusive, deliberative process that I've been trying to encourage, I would of course welcome views on the structure or remit and make-up of that council from those that are here and indeed from other industry partners too. And the Scottish Government will have more about that approach to developing consensual and consensus-building institutions in coming speeches. And the third foundation that I've spoken about is that targeted capital investment. As I've said earlier, the UK has a poor record on public investment. In the autumn statement, the Chancellor announced a real terms cut in the UK Government's capital investment budget. That has, of course, major knock-on effects for Scotland. Our capital block grant forecast is going to be cut by almost 10% in real terms over the next 5 years. But this goes far beyond one government. The Resolution Foundation has found that in the 40 years to 2022, total fixed investment in the UK was the lowest in the G7. So to kickstart investment in a newly independent Scotland, we would set up a special fund. Our initial estimate is that we could use the fund to undertake capital spending of up to £20 billion over the first decade of independence. It would be financed through oil revenues and, if needed, through borrowing too. Scottish Government modelling has demonstrated that investment spending leads to an increase in GDP, long-term productivity capacity, and provides a sustained boost to our economy. We would also seek to align the fund's priorities with the European Commission's priorities and Scotland's industrial policy. EU connectivity, the ports, the pipelines, the interconnectors, they're all required to plug Scotland directly into EU markets and maximise the benefits from key sectors such as hydrogen, CCS and floating offshore wind, which will be a priority for this fund. Indeed, floating offshore wind is a huge opportunity for Scotland. With our expertise in oil and gas extraction in the North Sea, there's a clear read across in terms of skills. And we're already home to the 2 largest wind farms in the world. But to take full advantage, a significant investment in port facilities is required. Clearly, with the normal capital borrowing powers of an independent country, such investments become much more achievable. So in conclusion, the UK is, in my view, and indeed by much independent economic analysis, abnormal in respect of its poor economic performance compared with its peers. That means that living standards are also abnormally low. The UK is the poor man of North West Europe. Those trends were already taking hold before Brexit. Leaving the European Union means a further long-term hit to the economy. All the while, Tories and Labour offer nothing new. No hope, no alternative to the suffering that is caused by failed Westminster economic policies. But for Scotland, there is a choice. We can accept our place as part of this low productivity, high inequality economic model, or we can decide to chart a better course. That means taking on the powers we need to achieve the higher, more normal living standards enjoyed by comparable independent countries. No one is expecting dramatic overnight change. But with the resources we do have, with the competitive advantages that we have, the key sectors and talents that we have, we can start that journey to economic normality. That begins with firm foundations, key building blocks such as industrial policy for a new and better economy. And this is urgent because far too many people in Scotland, right across the UK, are losing hope. They look at Westminster and they see no one that is offering them a different choice. Just more of the same decline, but perhaps managed more competently than the current Tory government. But we must have higher ambition, not only because it is the right thing to do, but because of the enormous benefit it could have for Scotland's economy and, of course, for the planet. In the coming months, I look forward to giving further detail of the bold alternatives that we have to the failing Westminster economic model. I look forward to engaging with those in the room and, of course, more broadly with people across Scotland, with businesses and the communities of Scotland too, in what I hope will be a shared national endeavour. Because I know that we can and we must do so much better. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to taking your questions. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, First Minister. So we have some time for some questions. If I could maybe go first, if that's okay. You set out a vision there comparing where you interpret the UK just now and where you think Scotland could be. As economists, we tend to think about change being quite gradual and taking a long time to take effect. So if you look at Denmark's manufacturing base, it's taken decades to develop. In Ireland, after independence, it took nearly 50 years before the UK stopped being its largest export market. So how long do you think the transition would be before the type of Scotland, the successful Scotland you're talking about, that you envisage, how long do you think it would be before you could genuinely say that that change had happened?
Two things. Well, a few things actually. Because first and foremost, we're not just waiting and sitting on our hands, not doing anything in order to tackle what is, I'm afraid, a low productivity, low growth, high inequality society that is based on a failed Westminster economic model. Where we do have limited powers, we're doing what we can even within those levers. And I mentioned the statistics throughout the speech in terms of when we came into office in 2007, how GDP per head has increased by 10% in comparison to 6% with the UK. So we're not sitting resting on our laurels, sitting on our hands. The second point I suppose I'd make is that we call it a transition for a reason. And do I want to transition? Absolutely. I want to transition away from that low productivity, low growth, high inequality UK that we currently have to a much more dynamic, high productivity, high growth and well-being economy approach that we want to see in independent Scotland. But it will take time. There's no getting away from that. Change will not come dramatically overnight. But I also say, and this the final point that I'd make, is that we're not starting from a zero base. So where we have significant opportunity, particularly if I look at the green technologies of the present and the future, we're already taking action to try to bring investment and create jobs. So I mentioned there, for example, the £500 million that I've committed to, and the first payment, the first instalment of that £500 million that I announced, or that Shona Robinson announced in the budget for next year. Of course, the investments and the work that our enterprise agencies have done already has helped to grow jobs in the net zero space over the last number of years. So it is that point that I'm not selling people, I'm not selling independence as being an overnight change, that somehow the day after we become independent, that there will be rivers of milk and honey and that manna will fall from the sky. There will be challenges, of course there will be difficulties. There will be a transitional process. But let's also be upfront and frank that the failure of the UK economy is hardwired, it's systemic, and there is a better course. And in order to deal with some of those global shocks and challenges that we all are facing, much better to have the macroeconomic levers, I would suggest, in your hands as opposed to in the hands of another government.
Okay, thank you. Come to some questions now. Questions from the audience. Nicola McEwen.
Hi, Professor. Thank you very much for the speech. Really interesting. You spoke very eloquently at the beginning about your approach being about understanding others and being cooperative and so on. So I'm wondering if, as we all expect, there is a change of government this year at some point. What's your offer? I know that you are seeking additional powers to do things within Scotland, but are there any constitutional scenarios Scotland's economy is inextricably linked with the economy of the island? What's the offer of things that you might do to add into?
That's an excellent question. Can I say, let's stop kind of beating around the bush. Keir Starmer is going to be the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, barring a catastrophe. I think we should just be upfront about that. And the thing for Scotland is we have a choice. And straying into the politics somewhat, but we have a choice, of course, in Scotland. Do we have MPs who will stand up for Scotland? And I would argue SNP MPs will always do that. Or do we just have do we have Scottish MPs that just make up the numbers down in Westminster, as I think they would under the Labour Party? But what is the offer that I can make to Keir Starmer? I've already made to Keir Starmer. He was at COP28 with Ed Miliband, and we very briefly managed to speak. And I did say to both Keir Starmer and to Ed Miliband that they should not and cannot backtrack on their green investment plan. And that is my offer. My offer here is that there is a win-win-win for everybody involved when it comes to unleashing Scotland's huge renewable potential. But it requires the UK government to act, not the current state of inaction and inertia that we see. And I'm more than willing, in fact, I would absolutely be willing and happy to work with a future UK government. In fact, I'd be willing to work with the current UK government in order to try to attract some of that investment into the renewable sector here in Scotland. And that's why I'm so worried about the fact that this green investment plan is going from a plan to what I think was described by Keir Starmer over the weekend or last week as a confident ambition. My worry is, as the months go on, I'll be less confident about that ambition, and it will become diluted more and more and more. So my offer is genuinely within the national interest where we can work together, let's do that. And when it comes to the second point, last point I'll make, is that when it comes to the cost of living crisis, which is the issue, is affecting far too many people in this country, well, we know that when it comes to poverty, that one of the biggest things that can be done to alleviate that level of poverty is lifting the two-child limit. SNP MPs will work with Keir Starmer. If he has a majority, if he doesn't have a majority, will work with Keir Starmer in order to be able to lift that two-child limit. And we know that that in itself has massive potential. All of the anti-poverty organisations has massive potential to lift not just children in Scotland, but children right across and families right across the UK out of poverty. So where we absolutely can work together, I would be seeking to do that. I seek to do that, by the way, with the current UK government. I find it incredibly difficult, to be frank, because we don't get much in the way of response. But I would certainly be willing to do that, and in fact, certainly willing to even have those conversations with Keir Starmer now, as I did very briefly while we were at COP.
I have some questions from some journalists to get to, so maybe I can come to Colin Mackay, STV first, please.
Thank you. You talk about independence being urgent, but isn't the message from the public over the last year in Rutherglen and the polls that it's you and your party that they're losing hope in terms of delivering that? And in terms of growth, we've just been to see Anas Sarwar. He says that you're having to put up income tax in the current budget because of your own mismanagement and waste. How is increasing income tax going to lead to economic growth in Scotland?
Look, I've just made the case of why I think independence is urgent. Of course, we'll put that to the verdict, to the Scottish people and the Scottish electorate. I would rather hope it was sooner rather than later, but of course we know the Prime Minister is running scared of that general election. What I would say to Anas Sarwar is that I think it's incredible that we have a leader of the Scottish Labour Party that is standing against a policy that has been advocated by the likes of the STUC, by Oxfam, by the Anti-Poverty Alliance, by many anti-poverty groups right across the country, which asks those who are the 5% highest earning in the country, Anas Sarwar, myself included, to pay a little bit more tax so that we can all enjoy the universal benefits, such as free tuition, baby box, no prescription charges, and so on and so forth, that we can all enjoy those, while at the same time having enough money to spend on targeting resources where they're needed the most. And of course, through that targeting, we saw last year an estimated 90,000 children lifted out of poverty in Scotland. And the last thing I'd say to Anas Sarwar is that, again, he offers not a single shred of hope, because, of course, he is advocating for a policy of staying outside of the European Union, a policy that goes against the wishes of the people of Scotland. And also, his party, of course, are engaged in this nasty, ugly race to the bottom when it comes to inward migration, which is needed in virtually every sector in Scotland, and which could help to boost our economy. So, look, Anas Sarwar can engage in those soundbites, but it'd be helpful to be able to see from Scottish Labour, or indeed the colleagues in UK Labour, any sense of what an alternative economic vision looks like, because so far it seems very much pegged to a failed Westminster economic model.
Thank you. Andrew Kerr, BBC Scotland.
Thank you, First Minister. You're saying it's not the land of milk and honey, but your critics are saying that you're indulging in fantasy economics with your cash boost or cash bonanza in independence. Are we now past that time of promises of cash bonanzas under independence? And just secondly, on the Horizon Post Office scandal, are you concerned about the whole affair and the time it's taken to quash convictions?
Well, look, on Horizon first, I am absolutely concerned. It should not have taken a television drama to get the UK government to decide to take action. The Scottish National Party has been asking for action in relation to Horizon and the injustice done to sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses for many years. I think the idea of almost a kind of mass exoneration is one that is very worthy of consideration. So it shouldn't have taken the UK government this long, and as I say, a television drama to prompt some sort of action. And there are some serious questions for others too, in fact, including the leader of the Liberal Democrats. In terms of cash bonanzas and not cash bananas, what I would say is that what, of course, I was quoting was the Resolution Foundation. They're not. They're not the Scottish Government figures that I'm quoting. Independent analysis by the Resolution Foundation showing that a typical household could be £8,300 better off. Typical UK household, £8,300 better off if, of course, we had the similar productivity, similar levels of equality or inequality as comparator countries. So these are not figures. I'm not saying that on the day that independence comes, because if we take the Scottish analysis of that Resolution Foundation modelling, then the figure would be 10,200. I'm not saying that on day one of independence you get £10,200 in your bank account. I'm simply making the point that you will see higher living standards because we have the macroeconomic levers. And some of for me, the two biggest things that we can do to drive that economic performance and growth will be rejoining the European Union, joining it in our own right, but also having a migration policy that works to our needs. And then I suppose thirdly, what I've talked about in terms of investment in key sectors of comparative advantage.
Great. And James Cook.
First Minister, just picking up on that last point then. The House of Commons Library reckons that capital spending per person is considerably higher in Scotland than it is at the UK average. I think over £1,800 in Scotland compared to £1,300 at the UK average. So my question is, how much higher do you think that would need to be in an independent Scotland for this major public investment that you've repeatedly talked about there? Where would that money come from, and in what currency would you be borrowing it?
So, look, our current position is that given the UK government's forecast on capital spending, we're going to see a 10% cut in our capital budget over the next 5 years. That's not a position that's going to be helpful towards the investments that we need to make. In terms of where we would look to build that new fund, I referenced that in the speech. Of course, that would come from oil and gas revenues, but also, where necessary, from Scottish Government borrowing. And we said up to 20 billion, and of course that will be phased over, of course, a number of years, mentioned for over a decade. So that's how we would seek to fund, and why we think it's important. I won't rehearse everything I've said in the speech, but of course important in order to build the capital infrastructure we need to really power the areas of key comparative advantage. Again, I'll happily send you, James, the detail that we've written in relation to currency. You know our position in relation from day one of independence, of course, having using and continuing to use sterling, and then moving as soon as practically possible to a Scottish pound, and making sure you have the institutions ready and prepared in order to do that. I don't have a timescale for that because we have been clear that there'd be some key tests, and again we can share with you the detail of that because we've put it out there in black and white already through our previous papers in this series.
I suppose, if you just don't mind, if I could briefly follow up.
I don't mind.
Thank you so much. I suppose what I'm asking you to get into here is the same thing that Professor Roy was getting to, is to be really straight with people. Professor Roy was talking about Ireland taking half a century to get to the position it got to. You've talked about it being not overnight. I was wondering if we could maybe get to somewhere in between the two of those that's a bit more realistic in terms of when you think an independence, how long really? Are we talking years, decades, half a century before Scotland would be in this strong position that you aspire for it to be in?
No, look, again, because I don't know the date of independence, trust me, I'd like to have been, 10 years ago when we had that referendum. But clearly, I don't know when Scotland will be independent. It's my job to create the political conditions that happen sooner rather than later. So it's not possible for me to tell you exactly a date in the calendar of when we would see, for example, X level of productivity or X level of growth. What I can tell you, since we came into power, we've seen GDP per head grow faster rate, a higher rate in Scotland than, of course, the UK. So I can point to some positive economic indicators. And all I can be, in terms of being straight with the people of Scotland. I can point to the evidence base that we have, and I've tried to outline over the last hour, of why I think Scotland has exceptionally strong foundations and how we can unleash the potential, which currently, I'm afraid, is not being unleashed, not because of any lack of will from the Scottish Government, but because we don't have the macroeconomic levers.
I'd like to take one more question from the audience. I was told to forecast to finish to aim at 2 p.m, but as an economist, I've revised my expectations. I'd like to take one more question from the audience, please, if that's okay. Eleanor.
Hi, thank you very much, First Minister. I'm Eleanor Shaw, the head of the Adam Smith Business School. So we're here in a university. One of the things that I'm keen to ask is, what more can we do to support our young people to contribute towards a healthier, wealthier, more inclusive, more equitable and prosperous Scottish economy, including the industrial policy that you've outlined?
Well, it's just a great question. And can I congratulate the University of Glasgow, but also other universities that were also involved in tercentenary celebrations of Adam Smith over the last year too. Look, we have tremendous potential. We know that with our young people, and even within the confines of devolution, we'll continue to do what we can to ensure that they have positive destinations, to have those well-paid jobs with fair work embedded in them, and security of jobs for the future, because we know the impact that has on their physical health and their mental health, and of course on the economy moreover. I think one of the big challenges, but also opportunities for us, is clearly within that transition from fossil fuels to net zero. And we want to make sure that not a single person is left behind in that transition. And for our young people, making sure they have skills that can have read across from sectors like fossil fuels and read across into the renewable sectors. And the second thing is making sure that, and this is where universities are crucial, making sure that the offer from our universities is matching what industry needs. And I had a very good conversation with university principals a number of months ago now, where there was a real enthusiasm from those university principals to look at what more they could do to be adaptive to what industry requires and needs. But I think the investment in the technologies of the future are going to be absolutely crucial. And of course we see great examples of that, whether it's in AI, whether it's in data, whether it's in the gaming industry, obviously largely in Dundee. And then I suppose the very last thing I would say is fair work. For me, and that's why we talk often about the wellbeing economy, it's why I have a wellbeing economy cabinet secretary, is that we want good, well-paid jobs for our young people. We want to make sure we're getting that balance right, not just focused on pure economic growth for its own sake, but for, of course, a happier, fairer, healthier and greener society for all of us. And I think that is the best endowment and down payment that we can make for our young people's future.
Thank you. As the First Minister said, this is the latest in a series of speeches that the Government will be setting forward over the next few months as part of their Building a New Scotland series. The speech will be made available on the Scottish Government website. Please do keep in touch with us at the University of Glasgow for all the work that we are doing in public policy. Before we go, can I just thank Scottish Government colleagues for visiting us today, and also to the team at the University of Glasgow for their expert support in hosting this event and making it go so smoothly. And to thank you, the audience, for joining us today. And before we go, can you please join me in thanking Scotland's First Minister for his thoughts and reflections today. Thank you. Thanks a lot.